Hey, everybody. More indie event coming to you right now. I'm super excited about this guest. I've met him at New York Comic Con. We've been together at a bar at the After Hour Connection. Let me introduce to you guys.
Hello, folks. My name is Gamal Hennessy. I am a comic book attorney, and I am the author of the book, The Business of Independent Comic Book Publishing. I'm excited to actually talk to you guys today and give you a very brief overview of the contents of the book that is currently available on Kickstarter for the next 9 days. So I'm just going to run it, do a little bit screen share, and let's see if we can get this to work.
And while he's getting that to work, I do want to stress that I've sat in this man's panels. An amazing, just you all better buckle up. Save this video. You're going to learn a lot. And this is a book you need to own. And here we go. And I'm going to just step out of the way and let him take over. So go for it.
Okay. You can see the screen?
You're good. We're good.
All right. Well, basically, like I said, this is a very brief overview of the contents of the book, The Business of Independent Comic Book Publishing. It is currently on Kickstarter, doing very well because the nature of the book itself seems to be resonating with people. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of why you should consider it. Before you start talking about a book like this, it actually makes sense to explain who I am and how I actually know, how I have any credibility to actually talk about what it is that I'm talking about. So I'm going to give you a brief rundown of who I am, where I came from, so that the rest of this discussion actually makes sense. I started my career at a Japanese manga company called Central Park Media, where I was general counsel for about 4 years. A lot of the work involved actually licensing pre-existing anime and manga programs from Japan and then repurposing them for the United States market. So when Marvel was actually ready to break into the Japanese market because they didn't have a presence there for a very long time, they needed someone who actually was used to negotiating with those type of companies, because negotiating with the Japanese is very different than other types of business negotiations. So they brought me in there, and I was there for about 2 years helping to open up the Japanese market, work on a lot of their merchandise deals that were going along with their films, and do some employment contracts related to the actual production of comics. When I was there, I actually realized that a lot of the artists and writers that we worked with didn't necessarily have legal representation that understood the comic book market. So when I left Marvel, I started a company called Creative Contract Consulting, which is a boutique law firm specializing in comic book law and comic book licensing. And I did that for about 10, 15 years. And the more I did it, the more the technology changed and the more the market changed, so that independent creators actually had a lot more ability to not just go and work for established publishers, but start publishing comics on their own. So one of the things that I did while I was working on this book is I also joined a company called Global Comics, which is a digital marketing and distribution platform for comics on a worldwide basis. So between all of these different positions, I've got about 2 decades on the business side of the comic book industry. And I tried to use all of the information that I got while I was in that life to build this book. So basically, what I want to do is go over the broad concepts of the process of independent comic book publishing. And the way I break it down is in 3 simple parts. There's pre-production, production, and post-production. Pre-production is when you actually gather the resources and make the major decisions that are going to go into your comic book publishing program. Production is the part that most creators focus on specifically, where that's where you make the book itself. And post-production is where you get the book out into the world in exchange for some type of compensation. Now, the reason that I created this diagram and made them into circles is because each one of these portions has several steps within it. And the reason that these circles overlap is because some processes begin while others are still taking place. So you have like a very circular process that goes on while you, from the time that you conceive that you want to make a comic to the time that the comic is out on the shelf and there's money in your bank account, hopefully. Now, to start out with the pre-production process, the first question that you have to ask yourself is, why are you making comics in the first place? Because if you are a creative person who has a story to tell in the 21st century, there are several different avenues that you can take. Comics is just one of them, and comics has a very unique distribution and cultural position. So before you start to go down the road of making comics, you have to really take a step back and say, well, why did I choose comics as opposed to anything else? And if I do actually want to make comics, because I believe everybody listening to the sound of my voice should be making comics, how are you going to define success for yourself? Because if you take people like Alex Ross, Stan Lee, and Raina Telgemeier, they're all individuals who are very successful in comics, but they're successful in a very distinct and different ways. So you have to kind of decide for yourself what success looks like, because that's going to color all of the decisions that you make down the road. Now, once you actually get to that point, the next major question is, what kind of story are you telling? What is it that you want to talk about? From the business aspect of publishing comics, there are three major concepts that you can choose from. There's an original idea, there's a public domain idea, and there's a licensed idea. There are benefits and downsides to each one, but basically an original idea is something that you think up for yourself and you own all the rights. The good side is that you own everything. The bad side is if it's original idea, no one knows about it. So you have to kind of educate people on what your book is about before you can sell it to them. A public domain idea is intellectual property that is not owned by any specific individual, so anyone can use it. So stories like Sherlock Holmes, Robin Hood, any kind of biblical or organized religion story will fall into that category. And the benefit there is that you have the right to use it. The downside also is that everyone else has the right to use it, so you're going to have to do something to set your comic apart from everyone else's if you go that route. The licensed option is the idea that you take a intellectual property that someone else clearly owns, you get the right to use it, and then make a comic book from it. The benefit there is you have a pre-existing audience, a group of people who already like that idea. The downside is that you usually have to pay for the right to use that book, and whoever owns the idea is going to have strong opinions about what you can and cannot do with what's ultimately their property. So each one of these is a very viable direction for deciding which story that you want to use. So ultimately, what you have to come away with at the end of this part of the process is you have to find a story that you love and a story that you're going to stick with, because making comics is a very involved and detailed process, and it doesn't make sense to invest the time or the resources into something that you're not really going to be interested in over the long term. Now, the first place you have to actually prove your interest in this story is in terms of the investment, because comic books are the type of thing that you cannot make money from them unless you put money into them. Now, how much money goes into this comic and where the money comes from and when the money shows up and when you have to pay it back, if you have to pay it back at all, are all variables that you can control to a certain extent. But you have to wrap your head around the idea that you cannot make money from comics until you put money into comics. And once you actually do that, then you're ready to move on to the next step. So if you have an idea, an idea is an asset that we refer to as intellectual property, and you have money, which is clearly an investment, you want to protect those things before you actually go off and make a comic. The best way to do that from a business and legal standpoint is twofold. Well, threefold. First, you have to actually develop a business plan so you actually understand, you create a roadmap for how you're going to get from where you are now to where you want to be. The second major step that you should consider is forming some sort of legal entity to protect all of your investments from outside forces. So you can create a corporation, a limited liability company, a partnership, whatever actually fits your goals is something that you can use to actually further your endeavors. And the final piece is to actually bring in professionals who have an expertise in protecting assets. So in this case, you're talking about an accountant who's going to be able to protect your money from a both from a spending aspect and from a tax aspect, an attorney who's going to be able to protect your intellectual property, your business, and your contracts with all the people that you're working with, and an editor who's going to be in a position to amplify and help you create the best story possible for your book. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to hire these people on a full-time basis and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, but it does mean finding them and getting access to them at least for a few hours each so you don't make fundamental mistakes that will undermine the rest of your publishing endeavors. So once all that is in place, then you kind of have to figure out who is going to be producing this comic that you're going to publish and who's going to help you sell it. Most comic creators that I have interacted with are very comfortable with the understanding of the creative aspect of who comes in to make a comic, whether that's the artist, the writer, the inker, the flatter, the letterer, the colorist, all those people. They few There is few less emphasis on the business aspects of publishing comics. So the marketing, the advertising, the sales, the print management, all of those things that you need to actually be successful with a good story. If you actually marry the two of those things together, then you have a much better chance for your book to be a success. Now, some comic creators literally do everything themselves, and that's viable. Some, on the other end of the spectrum, some of them actually hire one individual person for each job that is required to make comics. And then there's a middle ground where a group of people come together and then divide the business and creative aspects between them in how, depending on who actually has the strengths to do whatever job needs to be done. As any one of those three options is viable, as long as you understand that any job that you don't assign to someone specifically either will not get done or it will not get done well. And either way, you are putting your comic book idea at risk because you're not giving it every aspect, the attention that it deserves. Now, I think the biggest problem in comics, and this is not just for independent comics, this might be for comics in general, is that not enough time is spent trying to understand who is going to read your particular comic, because every comic is not for everyone, and every comic can appeal to a specific group of people. So the idea here, before you actually make your comic, once you have the script, once you have the team, is to understand who is the ideal reader for this comic. What is the demographics, psychographics, generation, and genre that actually would appeal to this book? And then go out and find those people and create a dialogue and an interaction with those people so that when the comic book does come out, you have a ready audience that is eager to consume it. You can see this kind of model play itself out pretty much every week in the movie and television industry, where trailers and interviews and behind the scenes stuff and a lot of marketing push is done for every film months, if not years, before the film comes out, so that they have that ready audience for the film when opening night comes. Comic books need to adopt a similar concept, specifically independent comics that are going to be fighting to not only find new readers, but try to pull existing readers away from the books that they already enjoy. The last aspect of pre-production, before you actually get your book started, is to try to determine how your readers are going to get your comic. Now, depending on who your reader is and what you actually have available in resources, there are a lot of different ways that you can reach your reader with your book. You can have print options, including bookstores, libraries, the direct market, or conventions. You have digital options, including like web, just um, web comics, apps like Webtoons and Comixology, or emerging media formats. And you could use some of them or all of them. It all depends on how you want your book to be received and what your particular target market responds to best. Now, after you've gone through that process and you have all the building blocks in place, that is actually the best time for you to go out and make your comic. Now, depending on what it is that you're going to do and resources you have available, you're going to take your raw idea and a certain amount of time to produce the best book that you can produce on time and under budget. The key to this is that comics is a very time sensitive industry, and it doesn't matter what character you're using, it doesn't matter how big your company is. Late books do not serve anyone. In fact, the certain aspects of the market will abandon you and your concept if your book is late, especially if you don't have a track record. So, in terms of figuring out what kind of book you're going to make, how long that book is going to be, how long that book is going to last in terms of like a single graphic novel or like a 300 issue kind of ongoing series, you have to be able to produce whatever you're going to produce on time so that you can actually make the best impact in the market. Now, when the book is done, it's time to actually let people know that the book is coming so that they can take the final step and go out and buy your book. But when we're talking about advertising in this context, we're not talking about yelling into the void, buy my book every 15 minutes on social media. What you're actually doing is you're simply continuing the conversation that you started in the marketing portion of the process and using those relationships that you've already created to kind of enhance the profile of your book and give people the information that they need to take that final step of buying your book and actually sharing it and engaging with the story that you wanted to tell. Which then leads us to the action that they're going to take, which is sales. Now, sales is a very broad concept because it does not include simply directly selling the book to your target audience. It could mean direct sales or indirect sales, where you give the book away for free in exchange for the attention that the book generates, and then selling that attention to a third party, whether you're doing that through advertising or affiliate marketing or sponsorships. In terms of sales, the revenue that actually comes in from your direct sales is dependent wholly on what your distribution model is. So if you decided to do print distribution, you now have those options in terms of bookstores, library, direct market, convention. If you have online distribution, you now have online sales revenue coming from different aspects. So you have to be able to keep track of each and every revenue stream so that you know how much money's coming in and how successful your book is over time. When the revenue starts to come in, the final major piece is managing that money, because the money coming in, like I said, you have to be able to keep track of it so that you know that books didn't go out the door that you didn't get paid for, and books that when the books you did pay for them, all the money that you actually spent to get the book done is actually paid out, whether you're talking about royalties to your creative team or if it's a collaboration agreement, revenue splits between the parties. You also have to keep in mind of any taxes that have to be paid or any outstanding money that you have to be paid, especially if you took out loans for your investment to get the book off the ground. Now, once the book is done, you have to actually consider what you're going to do after that book is on the shelf, because in the same way that a A very good athlete can't get into the Hall of Fame with one good game, and a musician can't, have a long-standing career by being a one-hit wonder. Once you understand the process of publishing comics, the key is to continue with the process depending on what your goals are. Now, you could continue to do more independent publishing, or you could decide to shift into freelance comic book creation where you're actually making comics for a third party. You can go into a third option, which is creator driven publishing, where you take your ideas to a publisher who already has a business model in place, and you split the responsibilities of making the comic depending on what it is, how the deal is broken down. So in many cases, you might be the one handling the pre-production and production, and then the publisher will come in and handle the distribution, the advertising, the sales, the revenue, and all the back end post-production stuff. It all depends on how it is that you want to structure the deal. The final option is transmedia or multimedia deals, where you take the original idea that you had and then bring it to a lot of those different narrative options that we talked about in the beginning. The other thing that you need to be aware of is that you've created something that very well may last beyond you. So the company that you created, you might want to consider what's going to happen to that company after you're gone. Are you going to leave it to someone so that they can continue the process? Are you going to sell it to a larger entity so that you can actually pull in that cash while you're still around? In terms of your actual revenue as that comes in, well, what's going to happen to that when you're gone? Because revenue from a comic book, especially if it's on sale for a significant period of time, or it generates revenue from multiple sources, could be ongoing. Who is going to get that money? Are you going to have a will? Are you going to have an estate? Are you going to have a trust? Now that you have these assets that could have substantial value, you have to consider what you're going to do with them for as long as you are going to have control over them. So, in closing, the process of comic book publishing, independent comic book publishing, has 13 steps. Each step impacts what the step that comes after it. And it is, on a certain level, a cyclical process, because once you actually finish the first book, the revenue can go straight into making the next books or straight into the next aspect of your career. So once you understand this process and you have, your creative inspiration and your creative skill, you now have both of the prongs that I think are the most important in having a successful comic book career. And that is pretty much the end of my song and dance.
That was amazing. First off, I just want to say that we do have a couple questions, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. I'm here for questions.
First off, Marvy said, great topic. Nice. Well done. And Geek Insider said, hey, it's a pleasure to have you here. We're looking forward to learning a lot from you, which is why you came here. So here's our first great question from Marvy. How can we protect our IP? Ripoffs are everywhere. So how do they protect their IP?
Okay, well, it's a three-part process. The first process you have to do is after you have created your intellectual property and you've actually shown, or you've actually come to the conclusion that it is in fact yours and it doesn't belong to anyone else, you have to protect it by registering that intellectual property with the proper government entities. That's either getting a copyright in almost all cases, and in some cases it's also getting a trademark so that you can protect the logo and everything else that you've done. The second portion of that is whenever you are doing a deal or looking at a contract, or there's someone's actually trying to engage with you for your intellectual property, you have to understand what the terms of that contract is to make sure that you are not inadvertently giving away ownership and control of your intellectual property and not getting paid for it. That is one of the major ways that people lose the control of their intellectual property. They literally sign a piece of paper and they give it to someone else because they don't really understand what it is that they're signing. The third thing that you have to do is you have to monitor and maintain control of your intellectual property. If someone else goes out and uses something that you own, you have to have the mechanisms in place, whether it's you have Google alerts for every time the name of your book or your character pops up, or you hire a service to monitor potential infringement. You cannot protect your intellectual property unless you're actually actively enforcing those rights. So again, it's three parts: register your work, understand your contracts, and protect yourself against infringement. There's one more thing that I want to show you, because if people want to reach me after this this event, I want to just show how they can do that.
By all means, you doing a screen share? I'll put it up right now.
Doing a screen share. Here you go.
And oops. Oh, there we go. Take us not only a screenshot of this, guys, but we actually had pre-prepared for just this show. We have that's my son in the background. We have this. Do it. Take a quick screenshot right now of this and follow it back. And I'm going to hand it back over to our guest.
Very good. Yeah. So if you let me know what the next question is, because they can actually look at this instead of staring at my face.
Fair enough. From an actual earlier, someone asked me to ask a few questions, so here they are. This is the first one. Mm-hmm. What is the difference between a trademark and a copyright?
Well, the easiest way to explain the difference between a trademark and a copyright is to understand the difference between an image and a story. So here's the anecdote I usually use. Let's say that you read a story about a wealthy young man who survives a tragic criminal event and then uses his wealth to attain the skills and technology to fight crime outside the law as a vigilante. That is a story, and you can copyright that story as a literary work. Now, that story, believe it or not, has actually been copyrighted as a literary work by dozens of different companies. So Batman, Moon Knight, Green Arrow, Iron Man, The Shadow, Nighthawk. It's all the same story, pretty much. But because each one is a unique take on that story, each one has a specific copyright. A trademark focuses more on images, words, or other tools that people use to sell goods in commerce. So going back to our original example, let's say this rich young man has some kind of psychological damage and he has a fetish for animals. And for the sake of argument, let's just say it's a bat. And he slaps his bat on everything everywhere. And the people who made this story actually get the bright idea to slap that symbol on everything that they see. So hats, t-shirts, shoes, bed sheets, food, they don't care. They slap it on everything. Doing that actually associates those goods and services with that character and allows goods in commerce to be sold for a substantially higher price. The trademark is the image, the story is the kid who loses his parents in a dark alley. Does that make sense?
It certainly does. And we had Dave the Supreme says that was an awesome and great topic. And Marvy says, thank you so much. Another question we get asked a lot, and this one is, you just touched on it a little bit, but they want to know, well, what if I find out my title, just the title of the book, is the same as another comic book after they launched it? They didn't know, maybe they didn't do the right thing, make a Google search, but their book's totally different. What can they do?
Well, if you actually consider copyrights do not actually have to be unique, because as long as the story is substantially different and the characters are substantially different, you have created a unique copyrighted work. So, I mean, just think about it. There are how many different, both Marvel and DC have a character called Hercules. They have a copyright in the character called Hercules, or Werewolf, or, there's at least a dozen other characters that a lot of companies, they each have that name for a character. But if the character is different and the story is different, then you're not really running into a lot of problems in terms of copyright, as long as you can, A, you've registered your copyright, and B, that there is a substantial difference between the two books.
That makes sense. Okay, so this is a two-part one. You can tell me if you don't want to touch it, because this one's controversial.
Okay.
Both deal with what is fan art. Are you okay talking about fan art?
Sure, I'm okay talking about
All right,
fan art.
two different things. So the first question is, can I write a fan fiction book and then kickstart it legally if I plan not to make any money on it?
Well, fan fiction, by definition, it constitutes copyright infringement and possibly trademark infringement, depending on what you do. So the answer to the first question is, can I make a fan fiction book and then sell it legally? The answer to that is technically no, you cannot. But you have to actually also consider the practical aspect of what it is that you are asking. Because in most cases, whoever, depending on who the copyright holder is, they may not come after you for your book just because it's not really worth the time and effort that it would take to do that. That doesn't mean that you didn't actually infringe their copyright. It doesn't mean that they can't come after you later. It doesn't mean that you're not going to have negative repercussions from doing that. I would suggest, if you're going to make a story and then you're going to kickstart it, first of all, don't make a story and then try to kickstart it with the plan of making no money. That doesn't even make sense. If you're going to make a story and not make any money off of it, don't kickstart it. Then you're not making or losing any money. But if you're going to do that, make an original story. You can make a story that's similar to whatever story that you wanted to write fan fiction about. I mean, 50 Shades of Grey was nothing more than fan fiction about Twilight, and it worked out for her pretty well. So you can figure out a way to make your story original and avoid any type of infringement issue. You just have to do it up front.
All right. And then, of course, the second part of that, well, it's not a second part, but they're related questions, so they're together. How legal is fan art if the person doing it is drawing it in their style?
Well, again, fan art, from my perspective, if you're making fan art and you're just like, putting it online because you drew it, okay, that's one thing, because you're not generating any revenue. If you're working on commissions and you're doing fan art, you are generating revenue based on the intellectual property of a third party that owns it. Now, the third party is probably never going to come after you because on a certain level, your fan art is actually raising the profile of their character. You are, in essence, giving them free advertising. So they probably won't come after you, but that doesn't mean that they can't or they shouldn't. It just means they probably won't because it's not worth it. So yes, no, it's not legal. Yes, you're probably fine. But that's not legal advice. You can't take that to the bank.
Yeah, none of this is legal advice. This is just us having a conversation right now. How is Disney reshaping the copyright laws? Someone asked. Are you familiar with that? I know there's a case coming up, right? Or
there have been several instances in the history of copyright ever since Steamboat Willie, because the idea of copyright is after a certain period of time, and at this point it's 70 years after the death of the author, that copyright goes into the public domain. Is that the public domain issue that we talked about when we talked about idea management. So things like Sherlock Holmes and Robin Hood, at a certain point, someone owned the rights to that, and now no one does because it shifts into the public domain. Steamboat Willie is actually the first appearance of Mickey Mouse. It is an extremely old, for copyright purposes, piece of work. Now, every time at least once and possibly twice, when the copyright for Steamboat Willie was supposed to shift into the public domain, Disney lobbied to simply have the copyright law changed so that they would not lose, because they don't want to lose the copyright to Mickey Mouse. That's like literally the last thing that they want to see happen. So they know that there's a certain amount of time they have, and when that time comes up, they simply try to change the law because you can lobby congressmen and senators and the Library of Congress to change the law. So that's what they'll do. But what that does is it has ripple effects down the line, because you're getting a lot of work that should have been public domain work by now isn't, because the goalposts keep moving back. So that is the crux of how Disney is actually attempting to influence the copyright law.
Let's talk a little bit about your book, and then we'll get back to a couple more questions. I do want to share this, and it's an exciting Kickstarter. And I don't know if you know this, but I'm right behind you in this picture.
Yes, because that picture was actually taken at the event that you and I were at the whatever Irish bar that was during college.
I forgot the name, but it was over on, I want to say 8th Avenue, 7th Avenue. I know the whole place. I know how to get there by the back of my head. Mm-hmm. So sad we won't get to see each other this year at any conventions. Yeah. How has it been not being able to go to conventions for you? Because I know you've actually done quite a few conventions.
Yeah, actually, this Kickstarter, it's actually a odd story. This book release was not supposed to be a Kickstarter at all. This book release was supposed to be a big splash at New York Comic Con 2020. But when I was writing the last 2 or 3 chapters of the book in March, was when COVID hit, and it became apparent that there probably would not be any Comic Cons. So the people that I have been working with in getting the book developed and getting the book out, one of them suggested, well, you can still create an event. The event can be the Kickstarter in lieu of, any kind of convention. So yeah, we were supposed to be, you and I were supposed to be having drinks somewhere, like looking at how I got this brand new book, but we're doing this now. So we've adjusted.
I always say it, adapt or die on these shows. You have to adapt or die. And that's what you've done with 536 backers already. How did you get the Hollywood Reporter to report on you? I am amazed. I want to know how that was. For those who don't know, he got day one some of the best coverage I've seen, and I was so excited because this literally is talking about the business of the comics. And until that moment, no one was talking about the comic books. And the minute you did that, suddenly mainstream media started paying attention to indie creators. So thank you for that.
Oh, well, you're welcome. But actually, it has very little to do with me, I think. One of the things that I write in this book is that if you're an independent publisher, independent does not mean doing things yourself. So in the same way that you should bring in an accountant, because an accountant's going to understand taxes better than you, and you should bring in an attorney because the attorney is going to understand law better than you. If you're talking about marketing and publicity and dealing with the comic book press or even the mainstream press, there are professionals out there that you can bring in and hire to actually help you get the word out about your book. So I took my own advice. I reached out, hired a publicist who has a lot of expertise in the comic book industry specifically. He runs a company, his name is David Hyde. He runs a company called Superfan Productions. And we talked about the whole process. He walked me through everything. I had to write a lot of the copy and answer a lot of the interviews and set up and would be there for a lot of the podcasts, but he actually set it up because he's a professional. So that's how I got into the Hollywood Reporter. You bring in a professional, and professionals get things done for you.
And how has your time been crowdfunding this? Because I've seen this shared by so many people. So many people have been excited about this. How has been this tour about it? Are you getting a lot of creators like me who are thanking you for putting this information out there for creators?
Absolutely. The actual response from the creative community has been overwhelmingly positive, partially because I think for the past year and a half, 2 years, I've been sharing small bits of the book in my Facebook group and on Twitter and in my newsletter. So people have a very good taste of what the book is going to be about, what the book is going to be covering, how comprehensive it tries to be. And then once I actually pushed it out into the world, I think because you have a lot of really good books on the creative aspect of making comics. You have a few books on the legal aspects of making comics. But I think part of the reason this has gotten such positive response is because there's not a lot of books. I don't think there's any book really that walks you through the entire process of making comics from the time you get an idea to the time you're actually, you have a functioning company, a functioning revenue stream, and you're building up your catalog. So I think because I tried to create something unique that comic creators needed, that's where the good response came from.
It's absolutely needed. I will tell you that there's not one book I've ever been able to tell a creator, this is where to go. there's some outdated ones that are unfortunately outdated now. They don't deal with crowdfunding as much. So, and they're not as close to. I've been following you for a long time now. We've talked in person. Like, I loved the things you put up. I like them all the time. I'm always reading. I'm sitting back here taking notes as I'm interviewing you because I'm learning too right now. And I've sat in on panels where you're part of. What's the future look like? Are we going to be doing a book tour when possible? Because we're all expecting the pandemic to stop being, so intrusive. What's the future of this book? Are you going to start doing more shows, or are you going to do I did want to ask you, this is my question. Will this be on audiobook eventually? Because
I've actually talked to, because I have, when I was working for Central Park Media, a couple of those gentlemen left that company to start their own audio production company. So we have talked about getting the book into audiobook. We just have to work out, because audiobooks the cost is based on finished audio hours. So we have to figure out how many hours the book would be, the price per hour, and figuring out that kind of profit and loss statement, because this book is like 450 pages long. So I don't know how many hours that would take for someone to sit there and read in a booth. So yes, the answer is maybe we will have an audio version once I figure out the numbers. In terms of what happens next, this book is we're going to deliver this Kickstarter version of the book to the backers. I'm not sure if we're going to try to get the book picked up by a major publisher between now and next year. But if we do that, then the actual retail version of the book is going to come out a little bit later. But I know in January, I'm going to start writing the next book, because this book is actually focused on one aspect of the comic book industry. So that's independent publishing. And I did this book first because it creates a foundation for understanding the entire industry. But the next book is going to focus specifically on freelance comic book publishing, because they're coming from the industry from it's a different revenue model. It's a different set of motivations. It's a different end game, pun intended. So the next book is going to build off this foundation and focus specifically on the freelance comic creator. And then 2023 or 2024, I do the creator driven book, but that's down the line. So that's what happens next.
And I'll tell you, right there behind me on that shelf will be where that book sits from this point on. Once I get my copy, I cannot wait, because I reference these books. I'm a big student of comics, as my son runs around. You get when you put a kid in a comic, they think they're a star. I have all the books always next to me. When I have a question, I highlight books. I'm notorious for getting educated about comics, and I love content like this because now I can tell young creators. Speaking of which, we have one who has a question right now, where to go. And Meredith would like to know from you, if a new creator is fielding publishers with really little to no budget, is it important to employ an entertainment lawyer with their first book?
Well, if you're actually talking about working with anyone, whether it's you're a creator and you're working with another artist, or you're a creator and you're working with a publisher because they're going to handle the publishing of your book, there has to be some kind of contract between you and whoever you're working with. And once you get that contract, you have to understand every paragraph of that contract and how it impacts your ownership of the property and your potential to make money from the property. And that's when you bring an attorney in to simply help you to explain to you what the contract says, and if there's things in the contract that need to be changed, help you negotiate the changes to that contract. So you don't need an attorney sitting around doing nothing, because attorneys charge by the hour. So you don't want to hang out with those people any longer than you possibly have to. But once you get something that needs to be done, get them in, let them do their job, and then get rid of them. Because like I said, they charge by the hour.
Perfectly said. And Marvy said the Lion King ripoff, big company versus small company, Disney won. Do you see where Disney, big companies, actually lose the copyright battles? Have you witnessed that?
There are some cases, I think, there's actually a very good book by Joe Sergi called the Law for Comic Book Creators, and he goes through all of the major cases that have come down since 1939, because ever since mainstream comics, where you had Superman and Batman and things like that, there have been legal controversies all the way down the line. So I don't know if you could say there's been major cases where they've lost, but they have actually had to share. Like there was a case between Marvel and Jack Kirby that was going to go to the Supreme Court, but they settled so that Jack Kirby and his estate actually got something out of all the work that he did over all those years. Siegel and Schuster, DC didn't necessarily lose, but they did have to actually compensate eventually the creators of, you know, the modern comic book format and, you know, their estate.
Bill Finger too is a great example of that.
Exactly. See,
and he was a movie. Someone made a movie and made a change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now I do want to take a few minutes today, and I noticed behind you have the Black Panther comic books, and I wanted to know if you wanted to comment on that, because today's a pretty heavy day. We've talked about it in some of the other shows, so if you want to share some feelings with that, we've been trying to do that since this morning.
The idea that somebody can get diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and then during the last however many years of his life actually go on to produce A, some of his best work, B, some of his most influential work, and C, go through the process of not just making the movie, but doing the press tour, doing the awards thing, doing all of that stuff, and never mention, oh, by the way, my body is falling apart internally, is actually, it's just struck me as quite profound. And the idea that this gentleman has, in almost all of his work, chosen very prominent, very iconic individuals to portray, and has done a very good job doing it, all while having, you know, stage 4 colon cancer, is a monumentally melancholy achievement. I guess that's the best way to say it. Because on the one hand, like, I've been looking at a lot of his like YouTube interviews and the like just statements that he made, and the context of it becomes so different when you realize, like, there was one, he was talking about two little boys who were like trying to live with, they were suffering from, you know, advanced terminal cancer. They were trying to live long enough so that they could see Black Panther, and how much that affected him. And I saw that piece, you know, years ago when it first came out, but to see it again today and know that he was dealing with what they were dealing with, it gave us so much more context to the story, that a lot of people are under the assumption that comic books, comic book media, comic book content is, at the end of the day, frivolous. But I have never actually accepted that concept, and I actually believe stories like this reinforce that concept of like a post-industrial mythology that we are creating together, both with the independent books, the mainstream books, the content that comes out of it, that actually impacts people on a far deeper level than the mainstream, if you want to call it that, is willing to give credit for. So I'm going to stop rambling now, because I probably could do it for another 2 hours, and you've got other guests. So there you go.
I think that's beautiful what you said. I know none of us were ready for it. None of us knew he was sick. Like you said, you look back and this guy just kept going. He never complained. He did things that I couldn't do. You know? I
couldn't do fully healthy, much less with, and because, you know, he has to go through the operations and the chemotherapy and however else, and he has to train to be able to, because there's always those videos that you see of how much the lead actors in a Marvel film have to train to actually be ready to do the topless scenes that are inevitable in the Marvel film. But so he had to do that while he was actually dealing with the cancer. And then after the films were over, he went out and did more films. He did 21 Bridges. He did Five Bloods, and there's another one that I think is coming out soon. So
yeah, I was saying that we don't even know what's in the vault right now because of the pandemic. So many, we only can hope there's a lot more from him that we don't know about yet, because it was. I remember when I heard it, I didn't even know how to respond to it at first. Like, I saw everyone sharing it, I was cold to it, because usually we hear about this. It just doesn't happen like that. Like, you hear a celebrity die suddenly, you're like, oh, they were doing something wrong. No, this guy did nothing wrong. This is tragic.
When I was sitting down, I think I got a text alert from like the BBC or something, and I immediately read it as Chadwick Boseman's father died of cancer, and I was like, oh, that's unfortunate. And then I looked back, I was like, wait, I put the word father into that text message because that it is not what it said. It said he died, and then I said, okay, well, I have to now confirm this, because you can get all kinds of instant news from the internet, and it's like, no. It was like triple confirmed, and then I went in and I watched Civil War.
I'll tell you, man, I woke up this morning hoping they were wrong. Like, it was just too sudden. Like, you saw it. Like, I'm sure, like me, you went to 10 different sites, and when CNN is covering it, and you have all these things, the only thing you can hope is maybe they're wrong. Maybe it didn't. You go into that denial, because I saw all my friends. We had Varian on this morning. He was heartbroken, talking about how he had to tell his son. And that moment where, it's just, you want to cry, and we're on air and we're not allowed to cry. We're supposed to stay professional, but I was happy Varian didn't want to go live last night and talk about it. I wouldn't have been in the mood. I needed that night to decompress and think about it to be able to do the show today. But I know one thing he'd want, because clearly he wanted to keep going. So we're going to go with a few more questions before the end.
Got it.
Meredith must have missed the fact that now that the book is essentially done, what's next for you? What is exactly the next stage? You said you're working on another book. So what's the theme of the next book going to be?
Well, the theme of the next book is to actually help a freelance creator. Once you actually get to the mindset that you want to make a living, either a partial living or your career from being a freelance creator, how to actually go about creating a professional business model that brings in the most revenue for the most efficient way to use your time. So the concept that I've been working with now and thinking about it is, whereas the book on independent publishing was about pre-production, production, and post-production, the freelance book is going to be about finding work, finishing work, and making sure that you collect your fee. So it'll be that 3-step process that will also be kind of a continuous process, because a freelance artist has to understand, well, how do you go about creating a body of skills and vision that are going to be attractive to the people that are going to hire you? And then how do you go about getting hired? And then how do you go about negotiating your deal? And how you go about managing your time from a lot of different sources to actually make sure all the work gets in on time? How are you actually selling not just your creative skill, but your reputation, your social media following, your contacts? How are you actually manifesting all of that to turn that into revenue that you can then live on? So that is the rough outline of the book, the business of freelance comic book publishing, which is going to be the only thing I've settled on is what the name's going to be. The business of freelance comic book publishing.
Well, I can't wait to read not only the one that I can get on Kickstarter right now, which you guys can go right now in our chat room too. We're going to show again our brand for those of you who came in a little late. Take a picture of your screen right now. Use that QRC code. Go to Kickstarter. It's on our main page, comicbookadvocates.com. Just go to the crowdfunding and get this amazing book. But before we let you go, I have to ask you, give me one moment from comic books that has stayed with you your whole life that you think is beautiful.
One moment from comics that has stayed with me. It would have to be, and this may sound bizarre, but I'm going to say that it was the first time that I went to. No, I'm gonna go with my first one, because I tried to change my answer mid-statement. There was a point when I was like 12 or 13 years old that I was reading, I guess it's the Gene Day run on Master Kung Fu. Master Kung Fu, probably issues 110 to 118. And in those issues, there was a nuanced poetical philosophy in the violence that I had never experienced before. And because I was like 12 or 13, this is like the mid 80s. And there was so much happening on the page, both like internally with the character, interpersonally with the character and whoever he was in conflict with, and extra personally with like the world that all of these characters inhabited. And it was something that I could understand in comics, the way comics were actually laid out, and there's the space between the panel, but I didn't understand it. I didn't understand like what Scott McCloud talked about in Understanding Comics about the power of the gutter until I was much older. But I could get this sense of all these things going on that I couldn't do when I was watching TV, or I couldn't do when I was watching movies, because there's movement and things go too fast, and subtext and all of those different nuances were difficult for me to grasp in those mediums. And I think that's when I realized that I was going to be reading comics for as long as there were comics. I didn't know I was going to be working in comics, but I knew I was going to be reading them. So yeah, Master Kung Fu, 110 to 118. I highly recommend them.
All right, we have 3 minutes just about left. I have to ask, when's your first comic book coming out? There can't be someone who loves comics as much as you just went out without having a comic book idea ready to go. When are we going to see that?
Well, this is a very short and ironic story. I put together a proposal for a comic. I put together a script, and Tim Smith, one of the artists on Black, and I knew him from Marvel for years. We did a deal together to like make this comic, and he said, okay, all I got to do is I got to do this quick Kickstarter for this comic called Black. We need to pull like 10K. Once that's over, I'll start working on your book. Black's Kickstarter went out, and they did like $150,000 worth of business for issue 1, which means, and then they got option for a film. They got like a publisher picked them up to do like another like 8 issues. Tim called me up and said, yeah, that book you and I were going to work on, not going to happen because I've got stuff going on. I'm busy. So that's right when I started working on this book. So I have like maybe 3 or 4 other like professional books like this in the pipeline. Somewhere in there, we might try to do comics again, but I don't know. I have the script. The script is still there. I just, who has the time?
Yeah, well, it's like Jack Kirby said, comics will break your heart, kid.
Mm-hmm.
But I do look forward to not only these educational books, which I highly recommend, and everyone, if you want to be a creator and taken seriously, this is a book to buy. This isn't on your bookshelf or in your tablet, because now, of course, people do beta, and I'm definitely going to get the book when it goes to audio, because I like to have audiobooks when I drive on to the shows, because you have 8 hours of driving sometimes. You might as well spend your time getting an education. But before you go, I need everyone to know, because remember, we're on the radio, so they couldn't see all the graphics. Tell them where they can find you on social media.
Sure. If you go to any the main social media platforms that I am on is Facebook, Twitter, and sometimes LinkedIn. But if you type in Gamal Hennessy, GamalHennessy, you will find me on all of those places, because there's not many Gamal Hennessys out there. You can find my website that I use for my legal practice. It's called creativecontractconsulting.com. That's all one word. And you can actually if you have a legal question about the books that you're working on or the company you're trying to build, I offer free consultations. So hit me up and I will help you out.
I really appreciate your time today. I know you're super busy. We're going to pass it off to the next part of our indie event. But thank you so much for making the time, sitting down with me.
Right.
It was one of the best interviews I've had in a very long time. Knowing, like, I told Meredith this. I was like, I'm nervous. I don't want to say the wrong thing when I'm talking to someone. You know, when you're in a room and you're the dumbest person, that you have to be very careful.
I highly doubt that, sir, but I appreciate the time.
All right. Well, thank you all. We're going to leave with this being on the screen. Thank you all. Stay tuned. More programming coming. And we will see you at the next.